We are going to be showing and explaining to you how to find a limiting reactant and to explain what it is. In this case, we use stoichiometry. Stoichiometry involves using relationships between reactants and or products in a chemical reaction to determine desired data. The whole point of this lab was to solve for the limiting reactant. A limiting reactant is a reactant that limits the amount of product to be produced due to insufficient amounts. To find out the limiting reactant, we poured different amounts of the two solutions, copper sulfide and potassium hydroxide, into 8 test tubes. The precipitate in test tube 7 and 8 levels off. In our lab, it was potassium hydroxide for test tubes 1 through 4, but quickly changes to copper sulfide in test tubes 6 through 8. In test tube 5, there is no limiting reactant because both reactants are used up.
The materials we used for this lab were 8 test tubes, 4 milliliters of potassium hydroxide, and also 40 milliliters of copper sulfate. We also used water, spatula, a ruler, and 2 burettes. Using the burettes, we poured 5 milliliters of copper sulfate in each test tube. Then we poured different amount of potassium hydroxide into all 8 test tubes. We filled some of them up with water to keep all test tubes at 13 milliliters. We then stirred each mixed solution with a spatula and let them sit for 10 to 15 minutes while we waited for the precipitate to form. The results of this lab were what the precipitate was, the height of the precipitate in millimeters, and what the limiting reagent was.
In this lab, it was noticed that KOH was a limiting reactant and the precipitate height was increasing gradually because the amount of KOH was increasing. But after test tube 5, the precipitate stood the same height. This is because the limiting reactant switches to CuSO4, since there is less than that of KOH. At one point, all are consumed at test tube 5 because there are equal amounts of both KOH and CuSO4. A possible potential for error is that if we didn't add the right amount of each solution. For example, if we added 6 millimeters of KOH instead of 5. This would ruin the results because it would show that the precipitate is a different height than it actually should be. Also, if we didn't use a stirring rod to mix the solutions together, it would take the reaction longer to take place.